Okay, let's start. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Strogorsky, and I'm teaching at the Moscow Architecture School March. Welcome to another event of our series of talks on architectural education, its present and future. This meeting will be held in English, and you can use the globe icon on the control panel at Zoom to switch to translation. Наша встреча пройдет на английском языке. Вы можете воспользоваться значком глобуса на панели управления, чтобы переключиться на перевод. Our meeting today touches upon the topic that we at the Moscow Architecture School March loves most of all. What does an architect do in a cultural context? The results of the intersection of architectural and cultural modes of production are increasingly becoming the face of the whole architectural discipline. They attract attention at exhibitions and biennales. Buildings that appear as a result of such intersections are more captivating than any others. And it is no coincidence that these are often projects directly related to the cultural function, heritage projects, museums, galleries, and so on. And what is also important for us in the context of this series of talks, this field of activity drags in schools of architecture, which may see themselves as art schools or liberal art schools with a particular form of expression. It's an attractive position, sometimes an easy way to behave, to be. And of course, there are questions. Can there be architecture without cultural function, or do we want to have such an architecture? To what extent does this position correspond to the present challenges of the time? Do we see this zone as a kind of autonomy, or do we see ways in which architectural/cultural projects can achieve an ability to transform the market and to the discipline in general? I guess some of these issues I hope will be discussed today by our guests, whom I will introduce right away. So today we have with us Anna Puigjaner, an architect, researcher, and editor, a co-founder of Maya, an architectural office that works on special systems which allow variation and change through time. Anna's personal research is focused on alternative domesticities, able to reshape present social structures. Anna is currently teaching at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. But she also taught at the Royal College of Art in London and at Barcelona School of Architecture, lectured at Yale, Harvard, Lisbon universities. And also Anna has been a finalist of the Rolex Mentor and Protege Initiative in 2016, and was awarded for the research Kitchenless City, which with the Will Wright Prize, also 2006. Will Wright Prize is a prize awarded by Harvard University. And our second guest is Ippolito Pestellini Laparelli, who is already well known to the Russian audience. He's an architect and curator based in Milan, and the founder of the Interdisciplinary Agency 2050 Plus. But also, Ippolito is currently curating the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, which will happen, I guess, eventually next year. And since 2017, he has been teaching at the Royal College of Art in London. Ippolito is also famous for being a co-curator and curator of many exhibitions and biennials and that sort of projects, including Manifesta in 2018 in Palermo and Montitalia multidisciplinary exhibition at the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, Chronic House, OMA's exhibition on the politics of preservation at the 2010 Venice Architectural Biennale. And in parallel, Ippolito has run a number of projects connected with the heritage and preservation, including the renovation of a cadaver in Berlin and Fondazione Prada in Milan. As usual, what I have to mention after this introduction and before I let our guests to speak, I have to say that in an hour, maybe less from now, we'll be happy to receive your questions from the audience, both from Zoom and from YouTube. And we'll include the discussion, make discussion open for everyone. Well, this is where I stop and give our virtual floor to Ippolito and Anna.
Hello, thank you, Alexander, for the introduction. Hello, Ippo.
Ciao, Anna, and thank you, Alexander, for the introduction too. It's lovely to be here on Zoom once again, mediated by this platform. So let's start our conversation. There are many things that I would like to discuss with you. There is maybe not enough time to discuss everything, but because we both taught through this extremely difficult past months worldwide, I was wondering how your teaching and pedagogical approach has been affected by the pandemic, by the fact that we were forced to teach through remote connections. And also, how did students respond to this crisis? In our case, we had incredible surprises, completely unexpected. So what's your experience?
Well, at Columbia, I think that it's going to be interesting to hear about the Royal College. At Columbia, so far, what has happened is, you know, Columbia is quite an international school. So the school provides a platform to have access to tools in an equal manner. So you know, it's a hot pot of different cultures that suddenly they are all within the same framework. So what happens when this framework disappears and is transformed into an online platform that all schools use the same? So one of the most critical things that has happened in the school is that we realize that these online platforms are really difficult so they do have a strict order. In other words, they don't accept other types of order or any casuality, any randomness. And that's quite problematic because somehow that affects to the neglection or the denial or any dissent. So to have dissent and criticality within an online platform is much more difficult. How was at the Royal?
Well, I mean, I find your point extremely interesting. It took us a while to actually figure out what was the potential or the complications of this phase. Maybe it's interesting actually to reflect upon what the students were able to come up with. Obviously, everything changed in terms of format and investigation. We received a lot of, for example, video production or film-based productions. And in a way, from the isolation of their homes, in some cases, they were really able to concentrate fully and reach out to experts globally in an extremely productive way. And we received extremely, in a way, thorough kind of investigations and research. And also, they were very ambitious in the way they were restituted. So maybe they did not investigate how to become architects, but they became extremely efficient filmmakers, copy editors, script writers, and so forth. What happened though is that by the end of the year, you know, at the Royal College of Art, the end of the year show is really important. The Royal College of Arts basically is made of different departments, and for people studying art, more specifically painting, ceramics, media, the moment of the show is actually the way they enter into the industry, they enter into the market, they get to be known by the galleries and so on. And obviously this was not possible this year. So also in this case, a platform was created. And for the first time, actually, you will be able to navigate every single work of every single student across all the departments. I completely agree. Every platform comes with forms of mediation that do not allow interference or dissent. So basically they become living archives, which are really efficient in terms of associative patterns, in creating connections also, in our case, between different departments of the schools, but very limited in creating space for political discussion. We did though an experiment actually with Farzin, that you might know from New York. He curated basically a platform just for the School of Architecture, only for the end of the year show, where through automated scripts of visual recognition softwares, he basically generated 6 storylines, starting from text from theorists that you might know, like Shannon Mattern, Susan Shupley, and so forth. And through this text and through this software visual recognition, projects would actually be combined together. And that was really powerful because it was a form of mediated curatorship that generated extremely interesting visual results. Although obviously there was no space for, there was no space for criticism in a way. There was no space for intervention. It was actually something self-generated, extremely beautiful, and you could really understand the storytelling potential, the curatorial potential, but maybe still limited in the way that it could become a political tool. And very often, I think this is something that also connects me and you. We think about schools as places where you shape citizens before professionals in a way. So the absence of this kind of forum dimension was really, really difficult to cope with, I must say.
Yeah, I think that we both are aligning on this, understanding the school and understanding academia as a platform for knowledge. It's quite classically, we're kind of almost coming back to ancient Greek, you know, like this idea of academia as a space of knowledge that is captured and transpassed to the next one. But one of the questions here is, which is the knowledge that you want to trespass? Or in other words, which conversation should we have in academia nowadays? And which conversation should not be having in academia nowadays? Because at the end, academia is a space of cultural production, but also is a space of, you know, it's a space where history is written. And as you're saying, it's a space where we can have a social influence at the end. Continuing this thought, how pandemic has changed the conversations at the Royal College, going beyond the platforms and the media?
That's a very interesting question. And maybe it goes also beyond the question of the Royal College, but you know, the school as a sort of, let's call it transdisciplinary attitude per se. I would say that the attitude of the school as a whole is rather shifted towards let's say an approach that I call intersectionalist in a way. So where multiple planes and multiple narratives are actually colliding together. What happened is that because of the outbreak of COVID-19, maybe certain crises or existing critical phenomenon became much more brutal in their evidence. I mean, from social inequalities and injustices to environmental emergencies and health crises, digital surveillance and automation, and the rise of political extremism and so forth. And for example, I come from a school where normally these narratives, and also I come from a different generation, obviously, would be looked at in silos, separately, you know, like without the attempt to actually find connections and patterns and point of communication between one and the other. While I think the outbreak of the pandemic basically maybe brought to the fore that all of these realities are completely entangled phenomena, and you cannot disentangle one from the other, which means that this idea of, let's say, an intersectional pedagogy became even stronger. In a way, what we're trying to do at school, and this is independently from the lockdown and the COVID-19 crisis and so forth, is to speak to students and future architects or future spatial practitioners who are not looking at the boundaries of the disciplines. They're actually trying to always question the boundaries of the disciplines in order to acquire enough knowledge to sit at those tables where normally architects are not present, you know, in order to basically participate in processes which maybe need spatial thinking, but normally, let's say, the point of view of an architect or a spatial practitioner in general is not taken in consideration. I think maybe the pandemic acted as an accelerator in our format, in our teaching format, to really make this attitude as effective as possible in a way.
This is the idea of acceleration of something that was already there. It's quite interesting because somehow, as you're saying, we're more aware of the interdisciplinarity of the discipline. It's not that it was not before like that. It's just that everything is more extreme, and that's interesting, and link it somehow with the conversation that we're having now at DISAP at Columbia, because as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has been aligned with many social crises in US, among others. One that it's already a latency, so it's not something new. It has been there for a long time, but it's good that a lot of social strikes and movements are rising in claiming for racial justice. So the BLM movement that emerged with pandemia, probably because as we know, pandemia has allowed us to have to be more aware of things. We're more sensible to things, probably because we are more connected, as you were saying. But one of the conversations that we're having is precisely how to, and let me use the word because I know that it's not an adequate word, but I would use it today, considering that we're trying to find better words, but we're trying to decolonize the discipline. And this is a really problematic issue because architecture as such, meanwhile academia exists, you know, obviously is still a Western concept, but exists from far before the discipline emerged. The awareness of architecture as such as a discipline emerged alongside capitalism and alongside the idea of nation state, alongside capitalism, alongside a lot of economic, political, and social structures that happened at that time and that are nowadays in crisis. So the idea of the discipline emerged with also the idea of classification of knowledge. Encyclopedia, Diderot, the need to turn a knowledge that was until then a craft knowledge into an abstract knowledge, something that can be communicated and transpassed not only through generations, but a transnational manner, or trans-territorial would be better term to describe it. So nowadays, when the ideas of a state nation, ideas of classification of knowledge and capitalism are into deep crisis, we might need to rethink our discipline. But how to do it when actually discipline was born within that? It's really difficult, right? So probably we need to kill the discipline, kill architecture in order to be able to produce something new. But we have been trained and, we work as architects. Probably it's going to be really difficult to behave otherwise in another way.
No, but I find this very, I'm really triggered by the idea of decolonization of the discipline, which is also links to the idea of destructuring the discipline. And maybe to a more contemporary notion of an architect as more a cultural agent, that basically needs to negotiate a galaxy of relationships of several complexities and so forth. And in a way, we have to basically acquire tools that are beyond the disciplines in order also to respond more effectively to the market. I personally, but I come from Italy where there is, architects are in crisis since, I would say, 50 years at least. But in general, the idea basically to intervene in policy design, in the material footprints of processes, at different scales, from the microscopic to the planetary, implies basically that you have to probably, as you say, kill the disciplines and enter other disciplines in order to basically participate to processes which are, in one word, more urgent today, to me at least. So if I need to find a way to actually formalize another way of being an architect, is actually to simply don't basically fall back into disciplinary definitions, so to say, but rather use the disciplines as an ecosystem of relationship to other processes. And in a way, when you look basically at maybe the times which were pre-modern, this was something that was actually embedded in many disciplines. An architect was by definition, basically a person negotiating the coexistence of different kind of voices, different kind of cultural agents. And as you say, it is with capitalism that specification came into the picture because of market dominance. So maybe the point is to basically decolonize the disciplines, but also looking at pre-modern models in the way they were also looking to pre-modern models of constructions, of city planning, of agricultural production, of material productions, and so forth. In connection to this, I was also wondering, I mean, you're a great architect and you've done a lot of things. You have curated, you're a researcher, you're a writer, but you're also a builder. I mean, you guys are doing projects. So how is your practice? And like you said, we come maybe from a classical understanding of the disciplines as evolved in this context, considering things, considering the urgencies which we are debating today.
Look, I would say that we are quite conservatist, meanwhile being quite radical. In a way, what I'm saying is that it's true that that's why we like to combine, more theoretical or installation or to be part of academia for us is really important because it allows us to think deeply about our contemporary condition and about the idea of the discipline as we're talking today. But definitely in the practice, we don't have to forget about that, but we cannot pretend as it has happened in history to pretend to change everything from 0 to 100, So what we do is to change little things that at the end have a large impact. For instance, the housing block that we built that had a typology that allow not to establish a hierarchy within the domestic space. So any kind of structural family structure could inhabit that house, which is something that if we look to the modern house, it's quite difficult to envision because the modern house was designed for a type of family and as the modern house, many other domestic spaces. So how to come up with a domestic space that is able to allow any structure to live there. So we did that from a private sector. And nowadays, thanks to that building, and not only that building, but many other cases around, the public sector is implementing that typology. So it's bit by bit, and it's always like joining forces. It's not only about your own practices, aligning your practice with other practices that do operate, as we are doing now today with Ippo, with you. Like somehow our conversations resonate, and probably our practices do operate in different territories, but definitely the fact that they are aligned, we might influence in legal procedures, law, and other types of regulations are really important for how our cities are made.
I completely agree. And I ask you these questions because today I had a conversation with one of my students and he told me, I don't believe any longer in construction. I don't want to operate as an architect through the making of projects, but which is obviously, I mean, it's a critical statement from our point of view, but he got a job at the UN. So, and he got a job at the UN through his work and research and design work at RCA in our studio. So in that sense, basically what I'm trying to say is that we are looking to an extremely interesting perspective in which as an architect, you can operate in multiple fields beyond construction. And of course you can use project making to and let's say facilitate the evolution of policies, to facilitate certain, basically the modification of certain standards, and there's a huge agency in that. But I think as a profession, by decolonizing, as you say, our disciplines, we have huge agencies also in many other fields. And it's absolutely touching that there are, let's say, young students from a different generations who are actually, you know, taking that opportunity, I think. And I wonder whether maybe this extreme lockdown we had to face maybe prompted also some of that new conscience in their minds. I'd like to go back to one thing, and maybe also starting from the prompt that Alexander sent to us. He mentioned at one point the work and thinking of Ivan Illich, and this early fascination for the potential of remote connections and technology and decentralization. And Ivan Illich, of course, was basically supporting this a peer-to-peer system allowed by remote connections, and abandoning the school, which as a special device was a space for coercion. And obviously we move in a completely different digital space now, in the sense that today, you know, technology and digital environment is not neutral. No, it's dominated by technocrats, algorithmic intelligences, corporate and state surveillance. Our civil liberties are always under threats, or our fundamental rights are questioned constantly by the system. And yet, at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of the lockdown, there was a sort of initial enthusiasm that reminded me of the early 1970s, when there was an enormous enthusiasm for the new space of the web as a space for the ultimate democratic relationships, basically, which is obviously very different from what we have now. Even Zoom as a platform was highly contested, and yet it was the platform more widely adopted also by extremely consolidated university institutions. I mean, Columbia, RCA, and I could name many, many more. So I was wondering whether, because I mean, you know, we have migrated to the digital for a long time. We were migrating before already, but we have migrated today. And what is the role that the institution can play in this migration? I mean, this is a new public space. It should be not private, or not just owned by private corporation or by state corporations. So what is basically the role that institution can play in this epochal shift? And it goes down to a question of governance, of digital sovereignty and data democracy. And I'm asking you because, I mean, you are from Barcelona, and Barcelona probably was one of the first cities implementing, through Ada Colau and the project of Francesca Bria, this incredible project of data commons, where citizens would be able basically to decide which data could actually be made available for, you know, data aggregation and big data analysis in order to improve services on a local level and so on. And I was really struck by the total lack of criticism that the institutions basically had through this transition, through the lockdown, in simply joining, you know, forces with major big tech corporations and platforms. So I was wondering whether this is a discussion that Colombia is having at all, whether the digital space is, in terms of, you know, rights for people who actually use it, it's on the table as part of our reconfiguration, you know, of habits.
Well,
no.
Columbia University is in US, and as you know, this data control, information control, and
that's why I'm asking. That's why I'm asking. That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
It's been a long conversation, but I think that it's really interesting. We already commented previously in other conversations with Ippo about this fantastic text written by Paul B. Preciado titled Learning from the Virus, that was published initially in the newspaper El País and later in the magazine Art Forum in English. And there, Paul B. Preciado argues how, as Ippo was mentioning, how the things that have emerged and have been really visible during the pandemic time were already there. So it's not like before and after, but rather kind of an explosion of whatever, of things that were happening. And what it's actually, all this awareness is related with the fact that we're transitioning from a society that has been controlled by a built form, by walls, by borders, by limits of the territory, to a society that is being controlled with unphysical realities. And I agree with Ippo that even if the conversation was already there, even if we can agree that it's not like data control, it's not a new conversation, it's a really extreme important conversation nowadays, precisely as you're mentioning, because due to the, with the tool of the fear, you know, we have accepted things that otherwise we would have never accepted. And this comes back to the conversation of the idea of the institution, that it's deeply linked with your curatorship of the Russian Pavilion. And I think that it's a really important, reliable conversation. If before we were talking about how to structure knowledge through academia, which is the meaning of academia. Academia at the end is an institution. So it's not only about how to structure knowledge, but also how to structure systems of powers and governance. So I think that it's really important to understand what means an institution nowadays and its relation with the old nation states or its relation with different types of governance.
Yeah, that's a big question. You know, when you think about the work that we are doing at the moment, I think we need to make a premise, basically. And to make this premise, I would like to refer to a text that Boris Groys wrote some time ago about the national pavilions in the Giardini of the Biennial. Yeah, and he referred to the national pavilions as greenhouses of exotic plants. With obviously, but I mean, with a clear sense and critical attitude, in the sense that it was perfectly describing the, let's say, the sort of, through almost a quasi-colonial perspective, the physical nature of the biennial, and proving obviously that it's a completely outdated model, in the sense that it's a model that, you know, global migration, planetary flows, cultural deterritorialization has completely put into question today. And yet, you know, this is a model that still exists because as political entities, nation states are still there. By nation states, I think we need to understand the difference between, we need to basically mark a difference between nation states and national identity, which is always a kind of terms of reference when you think about nation states. Nation states as political entities are a forms of, you know, governance in a way. I think me and Anna, we were discussing through WhatsApp that the model of the biennial is almost, you know, you can actually describe it also through the model of the WHO, the World Health Organization. Basically, in order to actually be effective, it needs states to implement certain guidelines. And the biennial, in order to actually operate, it needs nation states to implement certain guidelines, to operate within a certain framework. So that's one story. National identity is basically a construct, is a political construct that depends on historical specificity. It depends on who is elected. It depends on storylines by different politicians. So the two things are not completely in parallel. They are not completely moving in parallel somehow. Actually, we're talking about two different categories in a way. Our work for basically the Russian Pavilion investigates the role of cultural institutions in times of global crisis. It does it through the lens of Russian contributors and Russian voices in a way, but it's not necessarily specific to let's say, to a specific notion of cultural institutions in Russia. It's more specific to the evolution of cultural institutions in a moment of a market-driven society, in a way, when cultural institutions have lost, at least when you think about global art events like the Biennial, their ambition of being anti-chamber of politics, of being places for cultural exchange, also for local connection with certain contexts. So what we're trying to do basically is to reframe what a pavilion can be in a moment where you cannot talk about national identity any longer, but you can also not talk about a globalized vision of the world, because that doesn't land really anywhere. But also with an eye on the future, it's trying to basically understand what are the possible models, what can we do beyond objects and exhibition, in which way basically a pavilion can operate within the context of a larger cultural event as a catalyst for cultural exchange and as a political space. I really believe that basically the relationship or about the urgency of dealing with cultural institutions and institutions in general, like academia, because basically we miss political forums of discussions. And if we don't have anti-chamber of politics, as institutions should be, then the very act of making politics is deprived of any kind of effectiveness. And there is a complete discrepancy between, you know, civic society and power structures who actually are implementing politics. And by doing so, we're also questioning what makes a constituency, what basically tries to basically understand who makes an institution, you know, what is the architecture behind, and whether this architecture is actually made of people or maybe other agents who should be active political agents. And it's interesting to start from a very specific thing, which is, you know, a pavilion inside a biennial, because it comes with a very complex organization. And the fact that the pavilion is in an extremely fragile context, such as the Venetian one, it prompts also conversations about ecologies, about other agents, about human-centric perspectives, almost by definition. So in a way, you know, there is a constant tension between being specific and between being, let's say, relevant for a certain context. In this case, I think we have built a framework for an open discussions about the future role of cultural institutions. We investigate this through Russian voices, mostly younger Russian voices, basically. But I think the framework is valid on a more general perspective.
On that note, I think that the fact that pandemia has, I don't know if that idea was already there or not, but has pushed you definitely to jump into an online platform that probably you were already thinking. I'm just kind of speculating here, but definitely allows to have this cultural exchange in a more open manner, and also with a time frame that it's longer and allows a more easy access for the both.
I think you're completely right. You know, like I always refer to this strange narrative that was broadcasted by media through the lockdown, and I find extremely critical the idea of defining social distancing or using the terminology social distancing to describe our experience through the lockdown. In a way, we didn't experience really social distancing, but for those who were lucky enough to have a good Wi-Fi connection and a safe home, we did experience physical distancing, but not really social distancing. And we had enough tools to actually maintain our social structure intact. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was also a sort of bulimia for the digital. You know, you also have seen how many events went online and live. There was a kind of overflow of content to compensate this time, which was in a way suspended. And we took that very critically, in the sense we thought that we really had to operate outside this kind of fast consumption of data. We had to colonize the digital in a completely different way. by looking into a longer temporality, because I think the temporality of the biennial is problematic per se. You know, if you have only 2 years to fill, you know, over and over again with new content, you only produce something that has a fast consumption in a way. And the migration to the online works almost like a reincarnation for us. We took the exhibition, we took the work that we were trying to develop, we expanded it, we unpacked it, and we turned it into a sort of editorial platform. No live, basically a living archive that builds the foundation for future biennials to come. And also invites to a completely different way of being online, which is simple, it's accessible, it's low, let's say, low in terms of data consumption, both like in terms really of data that is mobilized, you know. It simply invites to a kind of, you know, slow rhythm or longer temporality. And to do that, we basically had to build a platform that was basic in a way. And by doing it very basic, we hope we made it quite accessible. And then here, this question of institutions is basically addressed through multiple medias and multiple languages. So film is one media, game is another media. Game became extremely big, even bigger through basically the months of the pandemic. And we thought that the gaming environment was actually a crucial aspect to actually reflect on. But also, you know, podcasts and opinions. So it really acts as a container in a way, with no intention to create anything that is overly spectacular. Because I think that's exactly the culture that affected negatively the nature of these biennials. The kind of rush for spectacle and fast consumption and so on affected in a way the original ambition of these kind of events. I sometimes refer to the early days of the 1970s when the biennial was directed by Vittorio Gregotti. And at the time, the evolution of the biennial as a whole, as an institution, was looked in symbiosis with the city of Venice. So the idea to actually reconnect the biennial to the way the city was kind of trying to evolve, beyond mass tourism, beyond the marketization of the city itself, of its monuments, of historical fabrics and so on, was really central to the discussion of the biennial itself. And we did operate in a completely different way. But the idea was to basically create, like in those times, something that would act as much as possible as an open forum without reaching fast conclusions in a way, just looking at 10 years from now.
Maybe talking about the open forum and after being critical with what a cultural institution means, with our technological reality, with the fact that we are aware that architecture is colonial per se. Maybe it's a good moment to open the conversation to Alexander and possible questions, right, Ippo? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. We could go on a lot, but it would be good to talk.
I'm happy to join, and I'm lots of what you were discussing resonated with the previous discussions and with my thoughts, and I wanted to ask you as a first question, and referring to the place of academia and the way schools reacted to the situation. I wanted to ask you this question, since we were seeing lots of schools having virtual graded shows, virtual global final reviews, and Moscow Architecture School did so as well. And it seemed that the landscape of academia is kind of changing through that, and schools became much more open or even exposed, and the students' work became very, very much exposed. And I was thinking from one point of view, it might be interesting to think how this could affect students' students' portfolio, how they could think of the future careers through that. It's becoming, if before we were always saying that architects have a long way after school, after graduation, have a long way to become professionals, to enter the profession in a regular way. Now we can see that probably it becomes closer to art schools when a young artist can become very, very soon can become a figure on a global scene. Young artists could be invited to play biennials and play exhibitions, or I forgot the word, markets like Freeze or that sort of places, and it kind of enhances the diversion from real practice, if there is such a thing, real practice. So what do you think, what are your expectations or prognosis, how this could change? First of all, will it last? And I think it will. I mean, despite all what Ippolito was saying about bulimia and maybe the distraction, which will maybe withdrawal, which will maybe occur in a couple of months or maybe later. I don't know how long this will take, but I guess after this temporary setback, I think the level of visibility is very addictive. So I think we'll still have virtual shows and lots of streamed discussions and creeds and so on. So how do you think how this could affect the academia previously protected from these views of others?
I maybe answer to your question because you made a comment on what I said. Basically, I also do think that we're moving to an hybrid model where maybe whatever you want to call it, online teaching and teaching in person and so on, will probably mix more and more. I was talking to people, friends of mine and colleagues who teach actually in schools which are really remote. You know, my smaller universities across Europe, but not in main capitals, for example. And they told me that for the first time since they teach, because of the lockdown, they started to feel less the periphery of the world, in a way, and less the periphery of academia. So in that sense, I do think that this obviously is, despite all the complications that come from using private platforms of communications and so on, a huge important point that is bringing basically practitioners and academics and scholars and so on, which are normally not exposed, closer to the discussions, or at least closer to the discussions which are attracting normally more attention in global capitals and so on. And I think that this relationship between, let's say, periphery and center has been really put into question through these years, through these months. It's not something new. I mean, this was already partially happening before, but the scale of implementation of this technologies has been maximized completely through the past months. I think it's important that in terms of visibility and the way that the practice of students and so on could change, is that institutions now take the responsibility for the future to maintain this trend. It's also up to institutions, not just to students of their own initiatives. I think students have enormous initiatives. They have Instagram accounts, they promote their work, they use very effectively social media, they're really fast in reaching out to other institutions and so on. But it's up to institutions, the institutions they belong to actually take this challenge and bring it forward, to institutionalize the idea of seminars such as this ones or different kind of pedagogical activities.
that's really important because obviously it's going with a double side. So on one hand, we have accessibility to things and to be exposed and to be able to perceive also what's going on in other territories. It's extremely challenging for your own work in a way, and it helps you to push further your own work. On the other hand, it's something, as Ippo was mentioning, that it's not new. Like online reality, it has been here for decades already, and we know the consequences. So data control, for instance, like, and I'm saying this precisely because it's deeply related with systems of value. So our academic institutions, they do know how to, regulate value. Students pay tuition and professors get their fees when you don't go as a reviewer or a lecturer. But what happens when all this knowledge is transformed online? It happens something parallel to this when all the culture was transformed online. There was a lot of misunderstanding that culture is for free, for instance, right? When nothing is for free. So maybe there's not an economical trade, but there's, for instance, a data trade, or there's some sort of trade. So we have to be super critical of the kind of trade that we are doing with this online teaching. And that's related with Zoom and other platforms.
I think that's a really, really good point, because I mean, we all experience an enormous amount of, let's call it, digital exploitation or extraction of labor, in the sense that the digital makes you extremely available to faraway places and so on. The potential is huge, but of course the implication in terms of professional, emotional, psychological labor are completely understated. So it has to be regulated to a certain degree, and that's why I think that institutions should take this challenge to actually institutionalize this practice in order also to prevent from extractivist attitudes, which have been extremely common. I mean, I had this conversation several times, even with schools from Europe or the US.
As someone who is sort of exploiting you right
now.
No,
that's not what we meant. That's not what we meant.
No, what we meant is that definitely institutions do need to control and get appropriation of online teaching.
No, but it's a very fair concern, and what I wanted to say is just I immediately thought of the transfer, which I guess it seems that it is forever with us, but it actually happened, I don't know, maybe what, 5-7 years ago, when the music streaming services appeared, and they completely changed the relationships between record labels, musicians, listeners, and so on, right? And changed the economical system of music distribution. So maybe in the future we'll have like a lecture Spotify and
exactly.
But I think that's a really interesting point that you're raising. At the same time, we always need to make maybe a generational switch, which it's crucial when you teach, because you teach to people who are much younger than you. And within our discussion also in relationship to the Russian pavilion, we are discussing basically what is the political space of Generation Z. The political space of Generation Z is gaming environment or social media, in fact. And they perfectly know, obviously, that those are privately owned platforms. They perfectly know that comes at consequences of their freedom of choice, privacy, and so forth. And yet, there is a general acceptance that basically that's a sort of status quo. It's a condition in which you have to move in order to be political, because that's the way they are political. I'm referring also to the work of artists like Joshua Citarella, who has been playing a lot, for example, with this kind of political spectrum of Generation Z. But I do agree completely with Anna that basically it is precisely because of this, because of the inevitability of falling into using Zoom in our case, or using other kind of platforms in terms of communication, social media, and political representation, that we have to ask institutions to take back the control and put citizens or students or teachers or scholars in the center of the picture. That comes also, I think, it's a question of privacy, but it's a question also of extraction of resources and research and knowledge in general. And I refer to the case of Barcelona because I've been working very closely also with some people who of the Decode project and so on, because that is a form of governance which we are completely missing. So the way things are happening super quickly will lead us almost without knowing, almost without any form of criticism, into a situation in which we will be just passive users in a way of a status quo that we cannot change any longer. And I'm very glad, of course, that obviously data regulation is completely different between Europe, China, Russia, South America, the US, obviously, but it needs to be implemented, especially because we all know the potential of these tools, but we have to basically create ways in which this space becomes safe. In the same way that Paul Preciado was referring to the fact that, you know, architectural typologies were spaces of coercion. Now the architecture of the network is a space of coercion, and it needs to be regulated in the same way that we have regulated architectural, you know, in reality, in the physical.
And when you, Alexander, when you were asking precisely how to protect academia, or how you frame it in another manner, but more or less you were meaning that that's precisely where you can define a safe academia, a place where culture has a value and where culture is understood as a critical tool to understand our contemporary condition. I think that's there. So that's the role of academia, to establish this platform that it's, let's call it safe. We could use it another word because safe now is charged with a lot of bad connotations, but you know, like it assures that there's a level of good welfare and you know, fairness, equity to access to tools, diversity, inclusivity.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I am also interested in how we could think about the risks of all the situations and platforms. What Ippolito, you were referring to this question, to this problem several times when you were saying that young people or Generation Z or whatever, that they're using social media platforms, for example, without asking too many questions, like in a position or in a state of mind where kind of all the risks are kind of factored in. I'm using Facebook. I know that my data could be, I don't know, sold or stolen, but it's kind of something that I signing up for without reading any terms. But at the same time, I was thinking that academia is also having some risks for students. For example, they are entering schools with more or less choices. It's different in Europe and the United States and in Russia, but the number of schools or the differences between schools are different. But they're choosing schools and they're relying on some credibility and certificates and licensing options, again, very different in different countries. And so there are also risks that are factored in it, which they cannot control. Like also, for example, even within a studio, which is called hidden agenda of studio, hidden agenda of a tutor, for example. How could, would it be possible, maybe through this new level of visibility, to calculate these risks more carefully, to make these risks more visible and well, discussable?
I think you raise a very interesting point, because there is nothing new in the way power structures operate. You know, now the focus is on the oppressive nature of technology or coercive nature of technology. But in a way, 40 years ago, I would choose my ideology by buying a newspaper from a specific political perspective. And as you say, by choosing an institution that stands for certain ideologies as opposed to others, by choosing even my TV channel on which I could actually watch the news. So that level of interference of your power of choice and so on, it's been always there. But I do think, and I think we are actually inheriting the way power structures are operating on civic society from pre-technological times. There is nothing new. Yesterday I was in a debate, as you know, with Yuri Grigoryan, and there was like a new a movie made by a group of students called Mayor, I think, from young architects from Moscow. And they made a beautiful, absolutely fantastic parallel between COVID-19 and they call it COVID-1917, but retracing exactly the idea of political oppression and how that translates through different medias and technology, but basically it sort of reiterates itself. So on that, I completely agree with what you said. And I do think though that basically today we know more. We have access to more knowledge. We can deal with more data and we can actually make that data visible and accessible. So there are, while before opacity was something that was basically structural to many political systems, many institutions, I think there are all the tools to actually make institutions and political systems completely accountable today by making processes visible. And simply because we can process, aggregate, and show more information. And that's something that I think is very specific to this time. So the point is not that technology per se or platform per se are bad or not. I don't think that's the question. The point is that we need to find a framework that regulates and that shows basically that through extremely visible ways, what's going on behind the screen. I guess that's basically the main point for me.
And what do you think? I mean, being a part of a very large, well, not a guest or a part, I don't know, how do you see yourself within the Colombian framework? But it's an institution with a very long history, one of the best, one on top rankings and so on and so on. How do you see this from your point of view?
Well, I think that, well, basically, our conversations now are a bit, it's not that we're not having those conversations, but are more focused on climate, like not before the pandemic, we're mostly focused on climate change as many other schools, but now climate change is deeply linked and mixed with race injustices. So from Colombia, we are facing a critical moment, understanding that even our name comes from a colonialist. So, and even our campus has provoked a lot of process of gentrification through history and racial injustices. So it's not that we're not having those conversations, it's just that we have so many hotspots at this moment the data control is there, but it's in a second level.
We have a question from one of our Zoom viewers. It's quite long, but I'll try to maybe to break it in several questions. But one of the topics that is raised in this question was exactly one of those that I was also ready to ask you. Do you think, or can we think of this global digital reincarnation as something that would lead to new international style, which would, of course, referring or answering to digital interaction, privacy questions, and so on and so on, but still would be in the same kind of way, would be disconnected with locality?
No.
I also don't agree.
Like, look, there's a huge difference. We are moving on and living back modernity in many ways, like the idea of private and public, for instance, all the types of classification that we used to be comfortable with are not there any longer, right? Our domestic space that was still recently a private realm suddenly is totally exposed. So apart from this, also many other things are happening, and among others is that we are not comfortable any longer with one narrative. So the idea, for instance, of the history of architecture as we understood it in the 20th century is no longer there. Look at the books that we are consuming and publishing. Most of them are really particular, precise, and specific, and unveiling particular stories or narratives, but they don't pretend to centralize and homogenize within one large narrative. So the idea of style might emerge, but I wouldn't think about a global style, or if that happens, it's totally wrong. Because again, it's colonizing, it's pretending that we are all equal when our realities are way different.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And also, you know, Latour has written extensively about the new definition of an intermediate model. We tried to mention it during our conversation between what we understood as the globalized space, which was produced by modernity, basically, and the, let's say, pre-modern idea in a way of nation state or national identity. And in a way, what I think is actually emerging instead is a new idea of localness, which is neither connected to one or the other. It's basically a way to be a citizen's understanding and addressing planetary mobility, climate change, obviously, and the multiple factors which are basically shaping the way we are connected and disconnected. I think when you look, again, the idea of the world that can be summarized into one single image, into one single statement is completely, I think, past by now. We live into plaques of very different conditions.
That doesn't deny the possible existence of new styles. That obviously it's always going to be there, because the style is, you know, is a cultural construction, is a social agreement that allows to unveil a common understanding relation with politics, with economics, etc. So it's through style that we kind of affirm our own position or our own culture. We do believe that, right? But what it's not, I don't think, as Ippo was mentioning, is that we're gonna be open to accept a global style if that could happen.
What Anna is saying is actually super interesting, because style as a cultural construct will always be there. The point is that you cannot associate style neither to a global image, neither to a political entity like a nation state or something. What happens if there is a certain style emerging in the peripheries of Paris, which is basically emerging or coming out from the meeting of people who have come to that place in the past 20 years and reshuffling everything that place used to be? What happens basically what happens about style when I'm dressed with items that come from 5 different continents? And what happens to style when the climatic conditions of the place where I live in are changing so rapidly that I become the foreigner, not the people coming to my place? So I think there are multiple styles emerging, but the thing is that they're kind of reshuffling everything that we knew about the way the world is constituted. And I completely agree. There is not a chance of a global style. And I think that's also what the pandemic will change very drastically is also the idea of this kind of, maybe the only global style that I know that I can actually recognize is the global styles of CBDs around the world, you know, big towers built for financial reasons to freeze capitals. The same towers are completely empty now. They cannot be occupied, you know. COVID-19, maybe it's the way we are really finally entering the 21st century, and we are ready for kind of a big revolution also in terms of our cities are shaped and the way they look.
Yeah, our interpreter asked.
CBD, Central Business District. Sorry,
yeah.
I'm gonna write it.
So, well, basically, it's a, you know, like Moscow City or Manhattan skyscrapers with the offices and so on. But I wanted maybe to expand the question that was asked about the international style. There was a notion, maybe you would disagree with that, but there was a notion that architectural websites and blogs like Art Daily and all the rest, they influenced maybe especially students in the way that a certain kind of approaches, stylistic, programmatic, and so on, became widespread. It is a very diverse kind of pool of ideas, but still limiting in a certain way. And at a certain point, I was also thinking that all these discussions becoming very accessible across the globe are also becoming a limited, although very diverse pool of intellectual styles, intellectual agendas. And to a certain extent, they are, for example, if we're talking about Black Lives Matters movement, they're kind of globalized in a honest way, because for example, if we're comparing the United States and the United Kingdom, the grassroots movement are kind of natural, original. But for example, here in Russia, we're really struggling with adopting these agendas. And we're trying to understand how this refers to our history and to our present state. And the problem is that part of the frustration comes from the kind of, I would say, willingness to belong to global community or Western community. And problems with how you adopt a narrative, or how do you adopt agendas that are not growing inside of your community, or maybe completely not connected with your realities. So as biennials at a certain point became kind of autonomous scenes for artists and architects, I don't know if you would agree to that. Academia could also become a globalized community of people discussing more or less same topics, not connected with what's going on around them.
Let me answer first how to relate the Black Lives Matter movement with other realities and other territories. And I'm saying this because even of course I teach at Columbia, US, but I'm from Barcelona, Spain, and my practice is rooted in Europe. So I also did the same reflection at the beginning. And the Black Lives Matter movement initiated in the US as a response to a particular history and a particular moment, expanded really fast, even in the US, to other social rights movements. So we're talking about race in general, not only African American, but just processes of colonialization, of establishment of powers due to race, one on the top of the other, but not only race, but also gender. So there has been a lot of claimants from the LGTB movement and different associations. So at the end, what we're talking about is the establishment of power of one community on the top of another community due to race, gender, or different conditions. And I think that if you think it like that and you analyze your own country, you will find out that there's a lot about that. So, and the movement could be linked deeply with the Me Too movement and other gender movements that have been happening in the last decades. And it's a conversation that it's not new again. It started in the late 60s when modernity started to be in a deep conflict. And then we have postmodernity, etc. But this conversation started back there. So at that time, colonial processes were already starting to be discussed. At the time, gender conditions were already started, and gender rights were already started to be discussed. And I'm not that acquainted about Russia, but I'm pretty sure that if you analyze your society, you will find out process of colonization, or in other words, establishment of power without not considering human rights and equality and diversity.
And also, if you look at what happened, I completely agree. And if you look at what happened, I think at the end, these are like social injustices, struggles, and the several places around the world are on the move, and they claim different instances, but the core of the question is, it's I think the same. It's the prevarication of one community on others, and from Venezuela to Lebanon to Hong Kong to, you know, like this is a common pattern. The world is on revolt. It's just that, as Anna righteously say, we are witnessing under our own foot basically how fragile capitalism has turned into, and how weak the neoliberal ideology basically is somehow proving to be. And we are almost like witnessing a kind of a self-defense systems at the moment, where certain power structures are becoming even more consolidated in order to prevent their own dismantling in a way.
And if you ask me, which is the relation with architecture, it's also a common, a common doubt. It's deeply linked, unfortunately, or
Absolutely.
There's, like as you might know, but just to, to remind that is really important. Most of the murders that have happened in the U.S. are related with gentrification. So the, as you know, Breonna Taylor murder or killed was related with the fact that that neighborhood was in the process of gentrification. So there was a push, a movement to push out certain neighborhoods, certain neighbors from that area. And due to this, the police was brutal. And as the case of Breonna, there are many cases that are linked with not only real estate, but built form and architecture.
But I mean, we could also extend this question of how space and city planning has affected the pandemic outbreak. Like I think in the US, but also at our latitude in Europe, there has been an enormous discussion about overcrowding due to real estate market and the way basically values were actually shifting between one side of cities and the others. And that there is, multiple proof that there was a kind of direct relationship. So, it goes down to the idea of linking basically what we call as social injustice to environmental injustice. It's exactly moving onto the same parallel tracks.
If we think about how architecture has And there are many, many examples, but in New York, we have one that it's extremely visible. And just look to your city and you'll realize how to establish power of one part of the society towards the other. In New York, we have the famous NACHA, that is basically is a system of public housing that during the 20th century, they filled Manhattan with a lot of collective housing. Arranging around 200 families within one building with one door. If you want to have control over a community, just do one door for 200 families and no use in the ground floor. So that's a way of assuring control and power of one sector towards another.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the architectural side of all of these discussions and revolts, it's a very good word, I guess, to use to describe the state of things. The architectural side of this, of course, is very interesting. I guess my question was, how do we find the courage and the power to explore local architectural circumstances and social and political circumstances connected with these global shifts, and not be kind of dragged in this YouTube, Zoom, globalized discussion of everything about actually nothing. At a certain point, Ippolito, you were, and thank you for bringing that up. You were referring to Ivan Illich and his project, and one of his ideas became very, really surprised me. He was imagining a kind of a system of discussions, how people could discuss mostly political and social topics, how they could register in a computer to find a group or a person to discuss some book. And he was very insistent on the idea that what people should register is not the topic of the discussion, but the book they want to discuss, so they would not impose their interpretation of the book on others. But the most interesting thing, which he described, would happen after people would find each other in this computer. They should go to some cafe or some place, some public space, and the person who arrive first should place the book near him or her. But the person who comes next does have an opportunity to not to reveal that he or she came to discuss this book. So it's like a date, which you how it's called, stood up, right? Stand up. So if you don't like the person who is sitting with this book near you, you can just go away and not saying that you also came here. So I think this kind of way of knowing people who look alike or think alike might also be something in a different kind of setting, digital setting, might also come up in this age. We actually have our time is up, so I would like, at this point, I would like to thank you, Ippolito and Anna, for your contribution, for your time, and to thank all the participants for their attention and some questions, not only those who were watching and listening to us now, but also those who would be watching on YouTube. Yes, many times. And also to thank our interpreter, Alexander Bajic, for his contribution. And our next event will be on Tuesday, next week on Tuesday, July 28th. And our guests would be Oleg Drozdov, a founder of the Kharkiv School of Architecture, and Nikita Tokarev, the director of March Architecture School. So new schools, Eastern Europe, very interesting setting. Maybe, well, we'll arrive to the same global topics. We'll see. Follow our announcements in social networks and on the program website. Well, that's all. Thank you very much. And
thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Ippo. It was a pleasure.
My
Goodbye.
pleasure.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Alexander.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Alexander. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.